I'm Gail Hammond, and I wanted to first mention we're welcoming back PAC-B TV. This is Jonah, who volunteers to do all the teaching. And he takes our presentations, and you can view them, or if you're talking to someone and they missed one and couldn't come, then they can go on YouTube, search the Schroeppel Historical Society, and there'll be listings of the programs that we've had. And in addition, we've set up a brand new website for us here. And if you go on SchroeppelHistoricalSociety.com, we have some of the more recent programs that we had probably last year's. But there's also tabs for events, and you can look at programs as we assign them out and the upcoming ones. You can look at any of the events we hold, like for fundraisers. So it's on our sign outside if you drive by the bottom row as the website. So I did want to mention a few of the upcoming events that we so far know about. So May 26th, Memorial Day, when there's a parade going by, we're going to be having a plant sale here. So if you're in the vicinity and you need some greens, stop by. Saturday, June 7th is the first day that we're going to be open for the summer season. We're open every Saturday in the summer through August from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. And if you want to bring your families in, or you can go through our historic objects. We have a lot of old maps, a lot of items that belong to families from the vicinity or from Schroeppel, dating way back to, well, the 1800s, the middle 1800s. And maybe you'll get lucky and find something that's belonged to a relative or something. So anyway, you're very welcome. And we have a lot of equipment in our research room. So please come and please bring folks. Our next program will be Tuesday, June 17th at 7 p.m. We try to do the third Tuesdays of the month for our programs. And Derek Pratt will be here. He's been here before. He did, what did he do? I can't remember right offhand. But he's going to do Erie Canal Open for Business, which is appropriate since it's, I think, the 200th anniversary of the opening of the Erie Canal. And he's probably going to touch on our barge canal system too a bit. So that should be interesting. So, I can't even read my cards, hold on. Oh, okay. So anyway, we want to appeal to the public to join Schroeppel Historical Society. We'd love to have some new members. We'd love to have fresh ideas. And all the membership money and the donations from people go to help maintain this building and preserve items that we have to keep us going. There are membership forms on some of the chairs here, and if you're not a member, we'd love to have you. Janet Moyer takes care of all of our memberships, so you can see her. So, tonight's presentation, I can say it, but I can't spell it. It's a history of Lake Niatawanta and Recreation Park. And so tonight we welcome Jim Fafaya, who has been here for two other programs that I know of in the past, which we all enjoyed, and Tim Carroll. And he's co-authored on this new book, Lake Niatawanta, etc. So their books will be for sale tonight, so after the presentation, a lot of you I know will want to grab one, including me. So with that, I'll let you take it away.
All right. Well, it's great to be here. Thank you for inviting us. We're going to try to do this without a microphone. Can everybody hear? Yes, good? All right, if at any time you can't hear, let us know. We'll speak up a little bit more. So, so we're going to talk about how we came to write this book. And Tim and I were both born in Fulton and grew up in that Fulton, primarily grew up in the Fulton area. So we are going to, oh, you're going to get that. Okay, good. We're going to take turns.
Watch fast, Jim.
This is a picture of the lake, Nyanawana, at a place called Stevenson Beach. Those that maybe were from this area or remember the beach being open. And for both of us, we have memories of growing up on the lake and being there at the lake. So I think Tim's going to talk a little bit about some specific things that happened at the lake.
Jim and I we graduated together. I took swimming lessons at the lake when I was 5 years old, and that kind of started my whole lifelong experience with the wonderful little thing. Next one, Jim.
Sure.
These are a couple of our classmates. I'll use their nicknames, Hector and Paco. You're going to hear me say sometimes, Nyanawana, we tend to, being from Fulton, we slide over all the syllables. I will go into depth of how it's supposed to be pronounced, but please don't hold me guilty for talking like a Fultonian. So you can imagine, say, Fulton was known for years and years as a good fishery. Can you imagine being, I think Hector and Paco were probably 10, 11, 12 years old at this age. They lived within a couple blocks of the lake, walking down there with your fishing pole or riding your bike, and coming back with a couple of 3-foot long northern pike, almost as big as you are. Those are the kind of memories that this lake has created over the years for a lot of people. Next slide, Jim. It was also known for boating. It's a small lake, a lot of public access. This is an ice boat. Ice boating was big for a while, but it was used for motor boating, kayaking, canoeing, sailing, ice boating. The guy up there, Hector, and I and 2 other friends learned to water ski on that lake when we were in high school. So, from a recreational standpoint, for years on weekends, there'd be 30, 40, 50 boats on that 100 or 600 acre lake. Next slide, Jim.
Okay. Yeah. So, as we mentioned, we grew up. One of my favorite memories. I grew up outside the city of Fulton, a place called Chase Road. I don't know if anybody's heard of Chase Road, but my family, we didn't have a lot of money. We didn't go on a lot of trips. We didn't go to vacations that some families had. But one of the things, this is the recreation park. So if you can imagine the lake off to your right there, maybe right in front of us. This park was open to the public, and you could bring a picnic lunch. And that was one of the things we did, was pack up picnic lunch. We kids swam most of the day. There was a place to play ball. My mom could sit back and relax for once after a busy week, that sort of thing. And so when Tim and I talked about writing this book, we were going to focus on the lake, but really Recreation Park really holds a lot of memories as well. So I want to talk a little bit about how we decided this topic for the book. So Tim and I graduated high school together. We have a classmate here, Kathy Andalina, who we all know. If you're from Fulton, most people know the Andalinas. But anyway, Tim and I graduated high school together. We recently had our 50th high school reunion. Should tell you about how old we are, right? Pushing 70. We decided to put together a little book of memories 50 years ago. What were the popular songs, movies, things that were going on in Fulton. And we really enjoyed writing that together and decided, hey, let's try to write a book. And we toyed around with different topics, and this was the topic, the lake and the recreation park, because we both had unique memories, and we knew it had a long history. That was how we chose this particular topic. And by the way, if you're familiar with some of my other writing, I tend to rely heavily on people's stories, memories, to do my history books. So I kind of, as you're going to find out as we go through the program tonight, I did a lot of the storytelling part of it, I guess, or the collecting of the stories and the memories. And then Tim's going to talk a little bit about his piece of it.
My background is in biology and wetland ecology. When I was 7 years old, I moved next to Black Creek in Mexico, New York, and I became a biologist immediately. I had never had trouble going to college deciding what my major was going to be. I went carried right through, so I handled the more technical aspects of this. Much to Jim's dismay, he had to work very hard to turn me into a storyteller. It's much more readable thanks to Jim's help on this. Maybe on to the next slide. So most of you are local, so have an idea of where Lake Neotawanta is. But for those of you who may not be familiar with this, the map here is Fulton. The lower left is Lake Neotawanta. The big black ribbon going through the middle is the Oswego River. You have the east and west sides of Fulton. The river heads north. We're about 10 miles south of Lake Ontario. You can see just up a little bit left of where it says Fulton, New York, there's a little patch of island there. That's Pathfinder Island. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But this is just to kind of give you the lay of the land for how the lake exists. The big thing about this lake, I'm going to walk up here for just a second. For about this is with the high school and junior high. From the high school and junior high all the way around here to North Bay is all in public ownership. Public access, it's over 2.5 miles of public access. You would be very hard pressed to find a small lake in New York State or anywhere else that has been dotted with cabins or camps that has that much continuous public access. That's a big deal for Fulton and a big part of why there's so much history and memories with this lake. Next slide, Jim. So, Lake Neotawanta was created by the glaciers. Over the past 2 million years, there's been 4 distinct glacial episodes. The last one began about 75,000 years ago. Reached its maximum extent about 20,000 years ago, covering essentially all of New York State except for Long Island, before it began retreating. As it retreated, it left something in its wake. As you can see there, Lake Iroquois was called a proglacial lake. It was in front of the glacier. You can see where it shows the ice dam, the outline of Lake Ontario within Lake Iroquois. You can see about where we are under about 80 feet of water at that point. At that time, while that ice dam was still in place, Lake Iroquois drained through the Mohawk River to the Hudson, which was called Lake Albany at that time, because that was still draining, and then to the Atlantic Ocean. Eventually, the ice sheet retreated, released the ice dam, and Lake Iroquois began draining through the St. Lawrence River to the Atlantic that way. And as it retreated to its current shape of Lake Ontario, it left behind 3 distinct areas in Oswego County that we're going to address later. Oneida Lake, which you can see where that yellow arrow is, that's the southeast corner of Oneida Lake where it drained. Lake Neotawanta and Peter Scott Swamp. So if you're from this area, it's a mile and a half down the road along the Oneida River. Those are all glacial relics of the lake, of Lake Iroquois, that are going to play a big role in describing what Lake Neotawanta is all about. All right, Dan. So once the glaciers left, humans started coming back into the picture. So over the period, beginning about 12,000 years ago, there were 3 separate native cultures that came through this area. Each lasted about 3,000 to 4,000 years. And the first one, characterized by the fluted point in the lower left, these were the Paleolithic Indians, the Paleo Indians. They were nomadic. They hunted the megafauna, the giant ground sloths, the giant beavers, the mastodons. Mastodon bones had been found on the south shore of Oneida Lake. So these animals did populate this area. And so these nomadic hunters just basically followed the herds. As the glacier kept retreating, the herds retreated north. The nomadic tribes followed them, and basically just disappeared after 3,000 or 4,000 years. They left very little remains. They did not leave a follow-up culture or anything like that. After they were gone, the next culture that came in is known to archaeologists as the archaic culture. And that's the guy up in the front holding the atlatl. Pursuing these giant megafauna, he had these big spear tips. As the megafauna disappeared, the next group of hunters needed something to take down that was more accurate, more powerful, to chase a smaller, more agile game. This was the archaic culture, also known as the Lamoka culture. A lot of studies were done. Lamoka Lake, which is west of the Finger Lakes. These were basically wandering hunter-gatherers. They would spend some time settled in one spot. Evidence has been found here in Pennellville and Brewerton of these cultures. They didn't invent the atlatl here, but it likely would have been used by this group of early Americans. And finally, the third one, represented in the bottom corner, is the woodland Indians, the archaeologists. Us would be the Iroquois or the Haudenosaunee. That is the three sisters: corn, squash, and beans. The Onondagas, who were the Iroquois tribe that lived in this area, did not have a permanent settlement in Oswego County. They used this for part-time for fishing villages, gathering. Their hunting or their settlement was south of Syracuse, up in the hills. They had palisades and gardens, raising these three foods that would basically sustain them through the long winter months. So this was the first group that actually had permanent settlements. The others were kind of nomadic or seasonal settlements. So the Onondagas are the ones that basically occupied this area before the first settlers came from Europe. All right, Jim, next one, please. So the Onondagas are the ones that named the lake. This was a sign, as I pointed out on the map, the North Bay Campground that was up at the top. This was a sign that was at the entry to North Bay Campground off of Route 3 for a number of years. Lake Neotawanta, the little lake near the big lake. Don't fall in love with the spelling or the translation right yet. We'll address that later. By the way, this sign was taken down last year, not because of misspellings or anything like that, but it was obviously kind of old and decrepit. And there's a project where high school kids are doing a lot of work, a single class on the North Bay Campground each year, and they put a new sign up, so that sign is no longer in existence. Okay, Jim, I think it's up to you now.
Okay. Whoa. Almost went flying. Okay, so I'm going to pick it up where Tim left off, which was those three tribes or cultures that came through. So the first European settlers came through, and the Oswego River was their main transportation, as you can imagine. That's how people got around to go long distances. And the reason that Fulton exists today, I believe, and many believe, is because there were some rapid areas in the Fulton area, some falls and some rapids over a mile or so stretch. And the first travelers that came through here in their canoes or their primitive boats could not maneuver over those falls or those rapids, so they perished, they died. So they ended up getting out of the water before that rapid area and would walk along, it would be the east side of the river. So you have the east side on the top part of the picture and the west side of the river down here. The reason it was mostly on the east side is the river bank on the east side was much lower, so it was easier to navigate to get out of the river and along the shore. And they would walk along the shore till they got past that rapid waterfall area, put their boats back in, and went on to Oswego into Lake Ontario. So over time, they started to stop there. This is a convenient place to stop, to look for food, to nourishment, to just relax a little bit. And soon, some of the early settlers, here you have a picture of Asa Phillips in the bottom right-hand corner. Tim's going to talk a little bit more about him later. He was one of the first settlers in Fulton. They decided it was a place they could maybe set up a little, almost like an inn or I call it bed and breakfast today, but a place for people to stay, restaurants and sawmills came in, things like that, and it started to develop. And again, because of that lower bank, industry, factories seemed to develop more on the east side of the river. There were a few things on the west side, which we'll talk about a little bit later, but most of the factories were on the east side. The west side was primarily agricultural, and there were farms, dairy farms, muck farms, upland farms in that west side of the river. We can go to the next slide. And muck farmers, this is a picture of a muck farm on County Route 7 outside of Fulton, became prominent in this time period. We're talking mid to late 1800s. In 1840, I have, in my research, there were about 8,600 farms in Oswego County, which was about, or excuse me, 8,600 farmers on farms, which is about half of the residents of that of this area, that Fulton area. So in 1840, the farmers decided to get together and create what they called an agricultural society. And this was a chance, farming, you know, families farm together, of course, maybe your neighbors, but it's kind of a solitary lifestyle. And they were looking for some some ways to connect with one another, share their farming techniques, their successes and failures. So they created an agricultural society and decided that after the growing season in the fall, they were going to have an agricultural fair. And in 1840, they held their first one, 1844, excuse me, in Oswego, I'm sorry, let me go back. 1840, they had their first agricultural fair in the town of Oswego. And they decided that they would move the fair to different parts of the county every year so that, you know, that part of the county could host the farming agricultural fair. In 1844, they had their first agricultural fair in Oswego, the town of Oswego Falls. And I did forget to mention, I apologize, the two villages that were in the Fulton area before Fulton became a city was the village of Fulton on the east side and the village of Oswego Falls on the west side. So the first time that the Oswego County Fair happened at the Oswego Falls was in 1844. So we can go to the next slide. And it became quite the fair to attend. So after the 1844 fair, the Agricultural Society moved the annual fair to different parts of the county. But people kept remembering the beautiful spot in Oswego Falls. And as time went on and they decided they were going to make the fair an annual event, they decided to choose a spot, and they chose Oswego Falls. And as you can see, if you look at that picture way up past the trees, that's Lake Ontario in the background. So we're now in this recreation park. What did I say? I did that again, sorry. All right. The Anawana's too hard for me to say. Thank you, Tim. So Lake Anawana is in the background. And it became a huge event. It was a 4-day fair. And people just enjoyed it so much that by 1855 it became the permanent site of the annual agricultural Oswego County Fair. We can go to the next slide. They had horse track, a horse racing track. Again, there's the lake, the Anawana in the background. Next slide. And it would draw in hundreds of thousands of people. It was a 4-day event. Some years they brought in 30,000 people for these events. We can go to the next slide. And they had really neat, this was a real fun part of the book for me to research, the kinds of events that they had. These are acrobats performing. You can see the grandstand there, the crowds of people. Some people saw their first automobile at this fair. Some people saw their first airplane, their first parachuter, things like that. And in its heyday, so the Oswego County held its fair there from 1855 to the early 1920s. That's a long stretch of time. And this was the fair to go to in central New York before the New York State Fair in Syracuse got big. People would come from Rochester, Syracuse, other parts of New York to come to this fair. Okay. Okay, so we'll go to the next slide. So this is kind of hard to see, but Tim's going to take over in a second, but we wanted to show you, I'm going to walk up here again, or up here. So here's the Oswego River, the east side, the west side, and here is Oswego County Agricultural Society right on this lake. Tim's going to talk about the names you see here, but here's where the society they had a couple of buildings, a building for big attendance, they had a luncheon and a dinner there, that sort of thing. But this was the fairgrounds right on the lake.
So you recall I told you not to fall in love with the name that was on that sign. The lake went through a period of self-discovery, I guess, trying to figure out what it should be called. I believe this map is from the late 1800s. By that point, it had been called Granby Lake for a time, Fish Lake, and Lake Neotawanta. Let me see where I am here. Okay, so Fish Lake was probably the first name that was given by the European settlers. A 1790 map appears to be the first one with Fish Lake named on the map. And some of the other early military tract maps indicated that Fish Lake was there also. For those of you who are local historians, you understand that the west side, everything west of the Oswego River was military tracts. This was land given to Revolutionary War soldiers in lieu of pay because the new government didn't have a whole lot of cash. And everything on the east side was the Schroeppel patent owned by George Schroeppel. I don't recall how he got that, but he probably bought it up, and that's been all carved up in the towns. But that was basically dividing line. Schroeppel patent east of the river, military tracts on the west of the river. And those early military tract maps that were divided into plots for the returning soldiers are the ones that first had Fish Lake on it. The first written mention of Fish Lake that I could find was in DeWitt Clinton's Canal Journal. You all recall who DeWitt Clinton was. And back in, when did he do this? In 1810, he was named to a commission along with a couple of other individuals to map out a route for a canal that would go from Albany to Buffalo, essentially. So on his canal, he kept a journal of his trip along the canal route. And he does mention in his journal the name Fish Lake. And by 1811 and 1812, local statewide gazetteers and statistical manuals or compilations also called it Fish Lake. Next slide, Jim, please. So you remember Asa Phillips from a little while ago. Asa Phillips bought basically all of the west side of Fulton. He bought a square mile of land, and he had mapped it out into streets and parcels for the village that he somewhat humbly called Phillipsville. Or on some maps, it's also called Phillips. He also called it Phillips Lake. So the man is not shy of self-promotion, apparently. I could not find any maps that showed Phillips Lake on it. I did see some maps that called it Phillipsville. This map is from, I believe, 1829, that has Phillips and the lake. If you remember the photo of the overhead, or the aerial photo with the shape of lake, the other one was like, I don't know who the surveyor did this, but they should get their money back. Because that is a bizarrely shaped lake. It's nothing like what the other one looks like. Even after some dreaming they did. That's just a kind of a interesting little side note. Phillips eventually realized that the east side of the river was where it was going to be at, and so he abandoned his plan to develop the west side. He sold off all of his plots to a speculator, to land buyers in New York City, moved down to New York City to speculate down there. Did not do too well, moved back, lived on the east side, but he still maintained a hotel he built on the west side. But after he bailed out on it, it reverted to Fish Lake again. Eventually, Granby was organized as a town, so Granby decided, well, let's name it after ourselves. So for a period of time in the 1840s and beyond, it was called Granby Lake. So the three lakes that you saw on there, on that previous map, those are those three names. 1854 map. Next one. So in 1854, surveyor Samuel Guile seems to be the first one that named it Neotawanta. This is cropped from a larger map that Guile created in 1854 of the Oswego County. And it's kind of hard to see, but it does say Lake Neotawanta on that lake. That appears to be the first mention on a large-scale map. In 1860, Peter Schenk, or Schenk, depending on how you want to pronounce your German, was a local surveyor. He was the one that was employed by Asa Phillips to lay out the streets. And those street names that he came up with are still the ones that use in Fulton, all the tree streets and stuff on the west side. So after, in 1858, when they drained the lake by state decree, Schenk drew a map with all the property owners and called it Lake Neotawanta. That seems to be the first local mention of Neotawanta as the name of the lake. Well, the controversy wasn't over yet. In 1870, and I'm going to read this, the Oswego Daily Times published the following. The beautiful sheet of water opposite Fulton, near the Fulton station, train station, was for many years dubbed Fish Lake and Grandy Lake. It has been called, and at one time an attempt was made to have it called Lake Como. More on that in a minute. We think it was the late Peter Schenk of Oswego Falls who had the good sense to hunt up the Indian name Neotawanta. We think it will be from this time forward on Neotawanta. Hold on. In 1892, William Beecham. Some of you may be familiar. I know Steve is familiar with Beecham being the name of their historical society up in Van Buren. William Beecham from Fayetteville was a clergyman, an anthropologist, a botanist, and everything. The Lord wrote about just a brilliant man. So he wrote in the Weekly Recorder in 1892, Fish Lake near Oswego Falls has suffered the infliction of several names, but the first seems most appropriate. 300 pickerel were shot along the shores April 4th, and they weighed from 5 to 10 pounds each. Well, William was pretty brilliant, but Fish Lake didn't stick the way he wanted to. Schenk appears to have won out. Neotawanta became the name. Regarding Lake Como was an early rebranding effort. Beginning around 1880 to the early 1920s, or before that, it was named Lake Como in advertisements, trying to entice people to come up here for what one advertisement I found called a day of unallayed pleasure. It sounds like it's describing a brothel, but advertisements in papers in Binghamton and Rochester and Syracuse had train fare for 50 cents or 35 cents to come up to Fulton to Lake Como, named after Lake Como in Italy, which was a playground of the rich and famous from Roman times till present day. It's still there. So the groups like the Odd Fellows and church picnics were held here for a period of years. I could not find Lake Como on any maps anywhere, but that rebranding effort was apparently successful because a lot of people came up here and had their races and stuff like that. But it appears that Neotawanta finally won out. The rebranding effort failed, but Recreation Park had a little bit of rebranding of its own, and Jim is going to get into that.
Okay, so if you remember, we were talking about the two sides of the river, east side, west side. So the city of Fulton incorporated in 1902, and we had talked about most of the industry was on the east side, but there was a prominent factory on the west side called the Woolen Mill. And some of you from Fulton area or that are familiar with Fulton remember that Woolen Mill was a big employer in town, a couple of thousand people, and they made cloths of different types. And one of my favorite parts of the research was learning about this man, John Stevenson. Remember we talked about Stevenson Beach earlier on, named for him. So John Stevenson, how he plays into this book and Recreation Park in Lake Neotawanta, he was one of the managers of the Woolen Mill. And he was also on the board of the Oswego County Historical Society. So, Agricultural Society, gosh, my language today. So when in the late 1919s, teens, going on 1920, the Oswego County Agricultural Society decided they were going to move the county fair location. Why did they do that? Well, because in time, over the many decades that they were there, Fulton became more of a factory town than agriculture. There were still farms, don't get me wrong, there were still duck farms and dairy farms, but It was primarily a factory town, and the Agricultural Society wanted a spot where they could really focus on agriculture. So in 1921, they decided to move their fairgrounds to Sandy Creek. And if you know Oswego County history to today, it remains up there. And that left the park, the fairgrounds, empty. And John Stevenson, because he was on the board, he was aware that it was going to be for sale. He convinced the woolen mill to buy the fairgrounds from the Agricultural Society to develop it. Originally, John wanted to make it a place for the employees of the woolen mill. Remember, a couple of thousand people worked there. It'd be a fun place. I don't know if you remember Nestle. Nestle had their park. Remember Nestle Park, if you knew, place for their employees to go. John wanted to do that for the woolen mill. But one of the things we learned about John Stevenson, he never did anything small. In fact, one of my favorite stories that I learned about him, and the woolen mill employed a lot of people. And when they were short on employees, they needed help. John would rent a train car, go down to New York City, go to Ellis Island, and as the immigrants came off the boat, he said, "Get on the train, I got a job for you up in Fulton," and brought them here. Employment problem solved. So that was kind of John Stevenson's way to think big. So he had big ideas. He also thought that this park area, the former fairgrounds and the lake area, could be something for the whole city of Fulton, not just the woolen mill employees. So he again convinced the woolen mill managers to open up this place for all of Fulton and any visitors to Fulton. So we go to the next slide. And John, like I said, he dreamed big. So the first thing we put in was an auditorium. It was a huge auditorium. In the book we talk about how big it was, but it was by far the biggest building in the Fulton area. And they had their banquets there and special events. The next thing we built, and you kind of see it in the back, is a dance pavilion. This was an open-air pavilion in the summertime. The walls could come up. As you can see Lake Nianawana in the background. Beautiful evenings. People could dance to big bands that they brought in from nationally known bands. And the next thing he did was he built a children's carousel. John Stevenson had a heart for children, and carousels were big. I think there's a carousel in the mall, isn't there? In Destiny Mall. They were big in the early 1900s, and he had this custom-made carousel brought in for the kids. All of these things were free entertainment for the people of Fulton, and people just loved it. Let's see. On their opening day, when he officially opened, after they bought it in 1921, in 1922, they officially opened the park. 20,000 people attended on the opening day. That's how big an event it was. So we can go to the next slide. And there's just a couple of other views. So here's the bottom picture is of, if you're on the lake, let's say you're in a boat looking up, you can see that dance pavilion in the distance there. There were boats they could rent, promenade, they could walk along the lake. It really was, it sort of reminds me of the New York State Fair when I look at it now. Okay, next slide. So, John Stevenson ran this park from 1921, and in the late 1920s, his health began to decline. And if we also know our history, late 1920s, we're entering into the Great Depression era, and businesses were suffering, including the woolen mill. One of the names that Fulton is sort of a tag name or a subtitle would be the city the Depression missed. You may have heard that. And that was indeed true. There were so many factories in Fulton that even though they all were hit somehow by the Depression, they were still jobs, and many people could work through the Depression. But those factories were hit in some ways, including the woolen mill. And the managers decided it was no longer feasible for them to have free carousel, free dancing, free auditorium, free events for everybody. And again, as I said, John Stevenson's health began to decline. In 1921, he passed. In 1929, he passed away. and the excitement for the fairgrounds, the energy, the financial support for the fairgrounds waned, and it lay dormant or not doing very well for a few years. In 1933, the city of Fulton acquired that park area which John Stevenson had built up. Can we go to the next slide? So for a few years, the city tried to maintain it like John Stevenson did, with big dance events. This is a 112-day dance marathon. Not 112 hours, 112 days. And as you can see, they have nurses on either side to just help the people there. But they tried to bring in bands like Ozzie Nelson, Jimmy Dorsey, those sorts of big bands to try to keep bringing in, but they just couldn't maintain. So eventually, the use of the park, and it just kind of went into disarray. And so during the 1930s and early 40s, it struggled. In 1943, next slide, the building that John Stevenson had built, the auditorium, caught fire, and it burned to the ground. We have the story of that in the book. 6 years later, in 1949, the dance pavilion caught fire and also burned to the ground. So by 1949, World War II had ended. Peace was in the world again. The economy began building up again. And the city of Fulton decided to build what they call the War Memorial to honor the soldiers who fought in the war and the efforts, but also to have a new, pretty good sized space for people to have big events. And that's a modern picture. The War Memorial continues today. It opened in 1953. The last thing that the city did for that stretch of time period, that late 40s and 50s, was they put in the West Side Pool. So here we have the War Memorial is in the background, and the pool was to the, I guess we'll say, the south of it. Lake is off to the background here. Why build a swimming pool when there's a lake there? Well, the city of Fulton had grown so dramatically, so many kids wanted to swim. We got reports, newspaper articles that thousands of kids would go to that Stevenson beach to swim, and it became just hard for the lifeguards to keep up with it. There wasn't enough room for kids to swim. So Fulton put in this pool. Many of us, Tim, I know, and I remember, I lived out in the country at the time. My brother and I rode our bikes in. We had one dime, cost a dime to get into the pool. You could spend the whole day there, and what a way to spend your summer months. So that was put in 1955, and I think Tim's going to take it over from there.
Can I ask a question? Where the War Memorial is that where the dance hall was that burned?
This general area.
Same space?
General area, yeah, right in that area. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So as Jim said, the West Side Pool in 1955 was basically the last shoreline development for a period of 30 to 40 years. The lake was still used regularly, but there was no need to do any further development. However, during that period, there were some concerns about the lake going on. Murky water, excessive weed beds, what else we have? Fish kills, and other impacts to the water that people are starting to think that something was going on. And a lot of those problems are due to the aging of Lake Neotawanta. Jim, next slide, please. Remember I told you earlier about the three glacial remnants of Lake Iroquois, Peter Scott Swamp, Lake Neotawanta, and Oneida Lake? Yeah, this is, hold on your seats, there's going to be some science content here. So Jim was not going to, make me completely into a storyteller. There's two terms I want to introduce here: succession and eutrophication. Succession is the process by which ecological communities change themselves to support a new type of community. In this case, lakes fill in. So the lake forms after the glacier leaves, there's nothing in there, plants and animals come in, silt starts coming in from the surrounding area. The lake starts getting shallower, plants and animals decay, nutrients increase. The increase of nutrients is called eutrophication. So that's the process of succession, is the lake changing itself because it wants to become a forest when it grows up. That's what a small, shallow lake in the northeast wants to do. It wants to become a forest. So these three were all created at the same time. So that they're all the same geological age. Each one of these is about 12,000 years old. But as you look at it, Oneida Lake has a lot of open water. That's 50,000 or 5,000 acres. Sorry, 50,000 acres. Neotawanta is about 700 acres. And if you look in the upper left, that kind of gray stuff, there's a little patch of open water there, but that's a big cattail marsh. This is the process of Neotawanta filling in. Marshes are starting to grow around the side of the lake and start filling it in. Peter Scott Swamp, that's all cattails. You and by there, there's small patches of open water. So these are all what Lake Neotawanta wanted to do, wanted to grow into a forest. It's natural for nutrients to accrue in a lake. That's what it wants to do. It wants to have more animals, more plants, more sediment, fill up, be covered in trees. So the reason for a lot of the problems was because Lake Neotawanta is growing up. Now we tend to think of it as being old because it's starting to decay in our eyes because it's open water or not open water. Actually, ecologically speaking, Oneida Lake is a little kid. If you look up in the northwest part of this is 3 Mile Bay. There's some cattail marshes there. It's getting its first teeth. It's still a wide open lake. It's still 35 to 40 feet deep. Water running in and out, nutrients not building up too fast. Peter Scott Swamp, on the other hand, is already filled in. So we'd like to think that's a grandpa. Now, an ecological standpoint, that's middle-aged. It's got a job, it's got a nice home, it's got a solid foundation. Neotawanta is the teenager of this. It's taking in all the nutrients it can eat, it's just growing, eating all it wants. The problems are with the eutrophication, it's like acne. It's kind of disfiguring, but it doesn't hurt the lake any. Lake doesn't care about that. So we tend to think of these as being really old because they're filling in, but really ecologically speaking, there's still tens of thousands of years before Lake Neotawanta becomes a forest. Next slide, Jim. So by the late 1800s, you gave me your date dyslexia. The 1980s, nutrient levels, especially phosphorus, had increased rapidly. This, a little more science content, is called hyper-eutrophication. All the dairy farms and farms that Jim had mentioned earlier run off from those into the various tributaries to Lake Neotawanta. We're bringing in lots of sediment, lots of phosphorus. Phosphorus is a limiting nutrient for plant growth and algae growth. So by the 1980s, nutrient levels had increased, and it resulted in high bacteria and blue-green algae. So the beach did shut down once in 1988. Make sure I'm not getting ahead of myself here. Yeah, so 1988, it shut down because of high coliform levels. Coliform levels are usually an indication of sewage runoff, maybe septic systems. Coliform itself indicates that it could have pathogens. So the beach was shut down in 1988 and never reopened. But by early 1990s, late 1990s, blue-green algae reared its ugly head. Blue-green algae does have some toxic properties, although the toxicity is fairly low in the lake. But that also contributes to the murkiness of the lake and creates, you have to have a certain sight of vision in the lake. You have to see a black and white disc lowered in, you have to see from about 4 feet. It's basically for life-saving reasons. Lake Neotawanta could never open right now because you can never have the water clear enough to promote or to enable life-saving, a search and rescue essentially. Next slide, Jim. So about there in the late 1980s, 88, some of the townspeople started getting a little bit concerned about it. So that's when the first Lake Neotawanta Reclamation Committee was formed. Or let's see what we can do about our lake. They did not have they didn't realize that the lake was going to be closed forever, or so it seems at that point. But they did recognize there were issues and wanted to deal with that. So in 1988, the first reclamation committee was formed. I was on that initial committee, and their idea was to recommend and implement restoration options. Do some research, what's wrong with the lake, how can we fix it? The solutions that came up at the time was watershed management. What can we do to protect the runoff from the dairy farms and the cornfields and stuff like that from outside the lake? Substandard septic systems, that sort of thing. Manual mechanical harvesting of the weeds that were growing along the lake shore that were impacting boating. And people could still swim in the lake, but there was no official public swimming beach because it wasn't allowed. So people still, the weeds were still impacting recreational use of the lake. And they also tried to find funding for dredging operations. So what we have here is the dredge that was used on the Fulton side of the lake. They began to remove the sediments that contained the phosphorus with the hopes that that would reduce the phosphorus, the nutrient load, the blue-green algae, and cyanobacteria would decrease, maybe making the lake swimming again. This resulted in some progress. Some studies that were done by Professor Syracuse showing the phosphorus level has lowered slightly slightly and steadily over the last 15 or 20 years. Still not low enough for swimming, but it shows that progress is working. There's widespread public support for the effort, and there are some new proposals to further reduce the nutrient load that they're still trying to find some funding for. So while the Reclamation Committee was looking at ways to remediate the lake, reclaim the lake, they're also looking at shoreline development. So for the first time in 40 or 50 years, they're ready to try and create something on the lake, part of it to indicate to the feds and the state funding agents that we want this lake, we have businesses willing to come in here and show that the lake was worth saving. Next slide, Jim. So this is the pier and pavilion at Bullhead Point. The Reclamation Committee did a bunch of development at Bullhead Point. This is right along where the outlet of Tannery Creek is on Route 3. It's basically across from, just past the War Memorial a little ways. So they developed this pier. They also developed along the Bullhead Point area. Some of you may remember that area. Bullhead Point used to be just a swampy area at the mouth of Tannery Creek. In the 1970s, Fulton tore apart its downtown. A lot of the stuff that was dug up and knocked down and was filled in there. So it was basically its made land. It had laid idle for from the 1970s until the 1990s, essentially. So the Reclamation Committee decided, well, let's do something with Bullhead Point. It's an area that we can find to fix up. So they built this pier with a gazebo. They built a pavilion. They got funding for this. A lot of it was community grants. Local businesses and stuff contributed. A visitor center, which helped promote more attractions along the lake. Story about this pier. Some of you may know Jim Best. He was a town of Granby judge, county legislator, well driller, been around for about 180 years. Knows as much about the lake itself as anybody. When they built this pier, they wanted this to go a little farther out into the lake. But in order to sink the pylons, you had to get down to some solid earth or solid bedrock or whatever. The pier also had to be able to hold the weight of an ambulance in case some fisherman caught a big one out on the end and had a heart attack and drowned. But as the farther out they went, the more difficulty they had in trying to find solid ground to anchor the piers in. So they had to cut about 20 or 30 feet off the pier because they just couldn't go down deep enough to hold the weight of an ambulance to haul somebody's carcass off the end of the pier. So again, this kind of represented a renaissance of the lake shore during the 1990s in an attempt to try and promote reclamation of the lake. There's a new renaissance going on now. Jim's going to talk about some of the newer developments that have gone on since the Bullhead Point area was fixed up in the 1980s and 90s.
All right, so I guess we can go to the next slide there too. Yeah, so one of the things that's happened, you know local news, Fulton has had some pretty tough times, loss of industry, people moving away, that sort of thing. But in the last 10 or 15 years, there's been a real revitalization. It's part of the reason we wrote the book, is to help bring attention to this area that was beloved for so long. There was a Friends of Fulton Parks created that put in several additions to some of the parks. This one being a teen park right on the lake. You can't see the lake from here, but in a future picture, you'll be able to see the location of the teen park. We can go to the next slide. As Tim mentioned, there's a couple of miles of public land there, and the Friends of Fulton Parks and other organizations have built a trail, so you can park at North Bay, park your car, and walk for a couple of miles right along the lakeshore. Tim is an expert bird specimen identifier. How do you describe yourself?
Bird watcher.
Bird watcher, much better than. But you know, he gives tours on the lake there. So you can see the lake in the distance there. Beautiful place to walk, that sort of thing. So let's go to the next slide. And this is the newest addition, the War Memorial, which you can't see, but it's just off to the right. Of course, there's the lake. This was money raised from the Shinneman Foundation of Oswego County, the Jim and Julie Boeheim Foundation, put in these outdoor basketball courts. And it's just going to add so much for young people of all ages, to do right on the lakeshore here. So we kind of feel that John Stevenson big idea momentum happening here. Okay, next slide. Included in that is a group called the Special Events Committee that formed 3 or 4 years ago. We just this past weekend had a big truck day. I brought my grandson to it. He loved it. Most of the events the Special Event Committee does happen right along the lakeshore, right in Recreation Park. So again, this revitalization of this area happened in the Fall Festival at the War Memorial Complex. Okay, all right, so Tim's gonna now reveal the big name thing. That's a teaser for you.
So this is a picture that I talked about earlier. Don't fall in love with the spelling or the translation. The Onondagas called it Neotawanta. Jim and I call it Neonawana, but we'll talk about the pronunciation here in a second. The Onondagas do not have a written language. So when the first European settlers came here, they had to try to do a phonetic rendering of what the Onondagas said. Now the Onondaga language has what are known as glottal stops or gutturals. Think of the way we say uh-oh. So in the rendering this written language, or this phonetic language in the written language, in order to put these glottal stops in there, they started using hyphens and apostrophes and H's and that sort of thing. So it resulted in all sorts of variations in the spelling. So that, you know, the Onondaga would come here and say, Neotawanta, we tried to spell it out. H's and hyphens and apostrophes and all that. So there were various spellings on various maps and various pamphlets and various advertisements. In 2001, enter ad executive Ed Vainer. Some of you may remember the name. He wrote a letter to the Fulton Historical Society about all these variations in spelling. And at the end of his letter, Ed said, "It seems as though everyone should settle on a spelling, historically correct or not, and proclaim it as such." Well, you're looking at two men who are going to proclaim what the spelling of the lake is. Jim, next slide, please. Unfortunately, this is a little bit small, but I'm hoping that all of you guys remember the excuse me, the Christmas story, Miracle on 34th Street, and lawyer Garrow and the judge. So we're going to borrow liberally from the Santa Claus argument from that movie. This is a USGS map, the United States Geological Survey. It's a research branch of the U.S. Department of Interior. They've been doing these maps since 1919, topographic maps, or 1901. And in all this time, once they started spelling Neotawanta, they spelled it Neatahwanta. So the USGS, an official arm of the U.S. government, declares it to be Neatahwanta. We will not dispute that. Case dismissed. That is look at the translation. You see here it says, the little lake near the big lake. That's what most of us grew up believing Neotawanta meant, partly because of this sign here. This probably came from a book by Chrisfield Johnson. He wrote a history of Oswego County, published in 1877. And in that book, he said this lake means little water near the big water, or little lake near the big lake. And he cites Linguists of the Day as his source material for this. Doesn't go much beyond that. There's also written in 1895 by John Churchill, another history of Oswego County, which used also the exact same language as Chrisfield Johnson did. So again, the linguists of the day are all we have to go on. Next slide, please, Jim. Okay, now we have, this is a little aerial shot of the area. Remember William Beecham, who we talked about earlier? Well, let me get the date, 1893, Beecham and his friend, Onondaga Chief Albert Cusick, offer an alternative to what the meaning is. Beecham wrote a book called Indian Place Names in New York State. Beecham was, he was an anthropologist, a botanist. He's also good friends with Albert Cusick of the Onondagas. Cusick was of the Eel clan. He was born in Tuscarora, but his mother was Onondaga, moved back to the nation, and became close friends with William Beecham. Beecham was well respected by the Onondagas. He was actually adopted in the tribe. Cusick became Tadadaho, which is the chief of the Six Nations. He used Albert Cusick's translations of various place names in New York State and for Lake Neotawanta. What Cusick told him it means, and what he has put in his book, is the lake hiding from the river, or a lake hiding from the river. So think about it. We have little water near the big water, lake hiding from the river. We've got a native Onondaga talking to a French fur trapper, going to an Englishman, to a German and a Dutchman to try and see what this means. So, remember the telephone game we played as a kid? Yeah. Okay, so Cusick said lake hiding from the river. So somewhere between the Onondaga and the English, Dutch, German, hiding can become near. Maybe it's not hiding, it's near. It gets kind of bastardized a little bit. The river becomes, a bigger water than the lake. But the thing that really kind of cinches it for us is, look at the river. As mentioned before, the Onondagas did not have any permanent settlements in Fulton, Oswego, Phoenix area. They used fishing villages, that sort of thing. So what they would do is they would leave their village south of Syracuse, wander down to Onondaga Lake, get in their elm bark canoes. Yes, elm bark. Birch trees were not prevalent in the forest at this time. The Mohawks would have had birch trees up in Canada and northern New York around here. The canoes were made out of elm bark. So if you see Onondagas and birch bark canoes, scratch. So they would come up the river in their elm bark canoes. As Jim mentioned before, there was about a mile stretch of rapids, which would tear the hell out of an elm bark canoe trying to go down that. So they would portage around there, get back in the river with the canoes, paddle on. And what I didn't point out earlier, Henry Creek empties the lake, kind of goes along the river, and that little Pathfinder Island up there, it empties in just past Pathfinder Island. It's about a 2 or 3 mile run from the creek. So you can imagine an Indian getting his own bark canoe, they're traveling by water, get up to Pathfinder Island, and on the east side they see, or west side they see a little creek. So let's paddle up the creek and see what the heck's going on up there. And through this woods, which is all big old chestnut and maple and beech trees, a couple miles later, they come on this lake, hiding from the river. Doesn't that make much more sense than little water to the big water? The way the Onondaga would have worked. So Jim and I are issuing a second proclamation. Proper translation is a lake that hides from the river, not little water near the big water. Therefore, next slide, the name of the book, Hiding from the River. So the book is about a single lake and a single park. But the story is really universal. It's a story of a town with some visionary men and women who decided to settle the area and built a great thing. Circumstance beyond their control. It economy, fires, whatever, goes down. There's probably thousands of little towns and cities in the United States and around the world that have the same sort of thing. Where they have, the village square with a bandstand where everybody went to on Saturday nights for music. No longer there. Maybe one of those towns in the west where the railroad decided to go to the next town over. The town disappeared because of that. What we want this book to do, it is kind of a niche book. People from Fulton will be much more to them, but for other people who did not grow up in Fulton, who read this story, it should spark memories of their own. If maybe a small town that they or their parents grew up, and experience the same sort of thing. They have their childhood memories of the old fishing hole, or skinny dipping in the creek, or going to the movie theater and sneaking in through the door at night. Those are the stories that really make memories for us. So, the present and future disappear. The past is forever. Memories make us rich, and that's what we hope this book does for a lot of people.
We're going to put the lights up and take some questions. One of the things that, just to add to what Tim said, with all the books that I write, I try to think that there's a young person out there that might read this and think, oh wow, we can do something like that. That John Stevenson, I keep going back to him, he was such a charismatic person, and he really had a vision for Fulton. Tim and I are banking on the idea that somebody's going to be out there, read the book, and say, we could do something like that again. So maybe you know somebody, maybe you're one of those people. But, we're going to take some questions now, comments, and then we'll be around a little bit too. I saw that hand first.
I have a question. It's probably a biology question, maybe, but
that would be for Tim then.
Okay. So you have a lake. It's 12,000 years old, and then and you guys swam in it when you were kids. You're not that much older than me, just a little. But
Thank you.
And then 10, 20 years later, the lake's flipping. And you mentioned some of the runoff and things environmentally that might have happened, but could you say more about that? Like, what happened? It seems like after 12,000 years, like a lake just suddenly getting old and starting to fill in.
Yeah.
Weren't there some accelerants that maybe we don't understand?
That's the term hypereutrophic. And also between the amount of runoff from the farms, you get runoff from the city, people using fertilizer, that sort of thing. The population of cyanobacteria, blue-green algae, is kind of in control for a while. But once it reaches that tipping point, once that gets enough, global warming probably helped too. Cyanobacteria does much better in warm, shallow waters. Once it gets established, it's very hard to get rid of, so it reaches that tipping point. If you think about it, Lake Erie has huge blue-green algae blooms that have just showed up in the last 10 or 15 years, like around Toledo. Skinny Atlas Lake, in the shallow, some of the Finger Lakes, and these are 600 feet deep, ice-cold lakes. Their shallows are having blue-green algae blooms every year now. Again, once it gets in there, without removing all that phosphorus and all the nutrients, it's just difficult to get away from it.
So is there a trigger or something that caused that tipping point, or do we know? Or?
No, not really. Again, it's all those factors, temperature, the amount of nutrients. That's really it. The lake hasn't significantly filled in anymore. The lake level is about the same as it was for years. It hasn't receded. It's not like 6 feet lower. It's just like, I think it's just at that point where enough is enough. Again, the lake's doing what it wants to do. There used to be a number of weed beds in there that would scavenge some of the phosphorus. Because there's a blue-green algae grows and the sediment develops and it gets darker, the rooted aquatics can't grow. So all those stuff that had died off now, that used to tie up the phosphorus from time period, is all just basically organic stuff, and it's releasing phosphorus from the material too. So all those things kind of combine to reach that tipping point.
You don't think commercial fertilizers might have put it over the edge?
It was a contributor, Mike. Again, I'm not sure how much phosphorus is needed to grow lettuce or onions or the corn. There's probably more nitrogen runoff, but the studies that were done by Brockport University and SUNY ESF did detect Sheldon Creek, which runs through the mucklands down off of 176 and County Route 8, that was the main contributor, probably 70-80% of the phosphorus flow into the lake. And that's where they focused on the Soil and Water Conservation District and Cooperative Extension, a number of other groups got together and talked with the farms there, build vegetative buffers, fence off the streams so the cows aren't pooping near there and stuff is running in, running off. So all those contributed to it. So over the last 20 or 30 years, the phosphorus levels, they still sample every year, the phosphorus levels are decreasing slowly but steadily. Not low enough to stem the cyanobacteria, the blue-green algae blooms, but it is decreasing. So there's hope in the future that that can be dealt with.
We have a pontoon boat, and we've gone out a couple of times on Iron Lake, and it shocked me how we looked down and the weeds around. In fact, it messed up our motor twice.
Yes.
So
That was one of
does
the big.
that mean that that's?
It means that Oneida Lake is a very healthy lake. Actually, it's, the shallow waters there, rooted aquatics can generally grow to about 6 or 8 feet of water. So that means there's plenty of light getting down there. It's not being impeded by sediments, by blue-green algae. The water's still clear enough to allow these things to root and grow. They are an impact to boating and swimming. That's why mechanical harvesting is usually the route people would go to remediate that. You have to do it every year, but you basically harvest it, take it out so people can access it area. But it's a perfectly healthy lake for that reason. It's a pain in the ass for boaters and people who swim who don't like stuff wrapping around their feet. It's kind of icky for some people, but.
So along those lines, you pointed out one section of the lake that is being filled in with cattails. So I understand the DEC considers that swampland now and it can't be remediated, it has to be left alone.
Any remediation has to go through a permitting process. As far as the wetlands go,
Wetlands, not swampland.
yeah, that's fine. They would not be going into there to the next remediation they're doing is using an element called lanthanum, which scavenges the phosphorus and turns it into a mineral. It's costs a few $1 million. They don't have the money to do that, but that's the latest flavor of the day. It would not be done on the wetland. You're not allowed to dredge in there. You would have to get permits from the state and the feds. Corps of Engineers would oversee some of that too.
But the cattails really can't get through them, when you don't get through.
No, the cattails can make very tight marsh. That's what they do. They send out stolons and runners and stuff, and it's difficult to get through for sure.
Steve?
I was just going to mention, I was fortunate enough to go to the book launch event. And I told some folks on the book I was expecting like 10 or 12 people in wine and cheese. And there were 250 people there, and a band and cheerleaders and people speaking, and it went on. So I just thought maybe you could talk a little bit about, the book isn't just a history of the lake, it's also, I think, kind of a cultural landmark in a way for the people of Fulton. There were a lot of people who were very emotional at this event because of what I think the lake and recreation park has meant to the city and meant to the people. Can you speak a little bit to what it's meant to people for you to write this book and be able to tell their stories and their memories?
Yeah, well, I'll start. Trying to figure out where the best place to start is. I know that after that event, several people talked about feeling enlightened, empowered, excited again. And I think that's been one of the missing pieces in Fulton is that area especially was an area where we gathered together. That's where our football games were, our softball games, the gauchos, if you remember the marching band, that was their space. And so one of the things Tim and I did when we wanted to create that evening was not just to do the program like we did for you tonight, but was also to capture some of that feeling. So we brought in the gauchos, we brought in some of the cheerleaders to get a feel for that. I think people are hungry for that. People want community. COVID knocked us out for a loop, right? And I think we're trying to learn how to be social again. And also again for the city of Fulton, there's been a lot of loss, and so cultural events, Nestle used to have a chocolate fest, that's gone, things like that. So the energy to try to bring that back, part of what I felt happened that night when we did that was that it created some of that feeling that that community feeling.
The way I look at it, let's assume that most of you grew up in Oswego County. When we were kids, it was a big deal to go from Mexico to Fulton or Phoenix to Hannibal. Every town was self-contained. You had doctors, you had hospitals. One of the things I tell people, you can't buy a pair of pants in Fulton right now. Not a new pair of pants anyways. There's not a store that sells pants. We have a regional hospital. You don't have a doctor's office. You have to go somewhere now. Doctors don't make house calls. Cities were self-contained. I think the idea that you could swim in, back when I was a kid, you could swim the east side pool, the west side pool, Lake Neotawanta, Sharps Pond, and if your parents let you, you could go down the river and swim. Now there's not a place to swim in Fulton. So all of us people of a certain age have those memories of a kid of having all those options. Again, going from Fulton to Oswego is a big deal. That's why we have rivalries. That's why Mexico and Phoenix have rivalries. You don't need to go anywhere else but your hometown. And I think this helps recapture that vision of the hometown that was so much stronger in the 40s than it was even for us in the 60s.
So the little pond was like kind of more, is that Sharps Pond?
No, that's an opening in the cattails, and I have not been able to figure it. It looks like it had been dredged at some point because it has the right angle in it. Sharps Pond is on the east side. If you come down Route 3 from Mexico, and you're taking Route 3 past where the burned area, the old motor lodge is, Sharps Pond is to the left of Route 3 when you go back there. And actually,
East side pool, right?
yes. The dam that was there is going to be taken down. Sharps Pond is no longer there. It's just a stream going through there. The city did not maintain the dam. The state decided that because you didn't maintain it, it's not safe to have it, so the dam is going to be removed. And Sharps Pond is gone.
Yeah.
Wasn't that dam struck by lightning circa 1975 or 76?
There's some, I'm not sure how, it could be, I'm not sure the
There
damage.
was some severe damage
Yeah.
at that time. I remember because it used to be a fair-sized pond, and
Yeah.
it was a stream, and then a few years later it was a pond again, like somebody had done some repair work at that time.
Maybe it was some dasher boards on top or something, but it's a stream again. Nice little wetland though. It's a nice cat. It's
I was Sharps Pond. That's
Swim
where we
there?
learned to swim.
That's where you learn to swim.
yeah.
What was the pond out on Rathburn Road?
Cowies.
Chilson's.
I couldn't come.
That's the kind of memories we got. A lot of our friends swam at or Parsons Pond out in the lowest corner. We all have those little memories of our own little communities that were contained, and those are the memories that make us rich. Yeah.
Other questions, comments?
Use the land and maybe it was a big truck.
Well, so one of the things Tim and I decided to do was donate the profits of the book to some sort of program that will support Lake Neotawanta and Recreation Park. So no obligation, but if you'd like to buy a copy of the book for $20, all the profits will go to, we haven't decided the exact program yet, but some program that boosts this idea that we're trying to do to rebuild that area. And then in addition, my books are here if you want to read about the Blizzard of '66. Some of the people here are in the book, their stories, the Muck Farms of Oswego County, Nestle. Those books are also for sale here, and we can talk about that. And we'll be here for a little bit longer to answer questions or talk one-on-one. But thanks again for being such a
Thank you
great
all.
audience.